Chris Freed asks, does Saturday's game against the Ducks, if it goes poor, be a turning point for how the Flyers fans view the current front office? Yeah, it does. Because, like, Drysdale looked bad again last night. I keep coming back to this point, but, like, how do I say this in a way? Like, you have to remember, I'm critical of this team. Nobody at the Flyers tells me what to say or how to feel. What you get from me is the 100% unadulterated way that I feel about the team. Danny Briere and his inactivity in the trade market when actual deals were being made prior to the Christmas break, that was a concern to me. And, like, it was Fletcher-esque. Now, I'm not saying that, like, this whole thing is about to fall apart or that, like, Briere's future as the GM of the team is going to be a disaster. Like, I'm not saying that. But, like, I have to be fair. I would have crucified Chuck Fletcher for not being involved or more involved in the Jiricek trade market when Columbus had made him available. There have been players dealt. The deadline will come up. If the Flyers don't move a Lawton, a Risto, a Frost, if they make no trades, if they make only one trade, like, I will be critical. I'm willing. This is pretty much my last window that I'm willing to give the organization the benefit of the doubt here. You have to make some deals. You can't just sit back and, like, wait for the market to come to you. Like, that's not how this works. I know that people were really concerned because there was an interview that Danny Briere did with TSN Overdrive, and people really got themselves worked up about the rebuild. Like, really, really worked up. I'll give you this. So a couple of days ago, and I'm going to credit Flyers Nation for the transcription here. Let me get this up on the screen for everybody. This was one of the things that Briere had to say about, like, let's say Mishkov to start. Like, we've heard what the Flyers have thought about Mishkov all season, but this was his quote about Mishkov to TSN Overdrive. There's a chance that Mishkov could turn into a star or superstar, but otherwise, you need depth throughout your lineup. You need your young players to become really good players. It feels like we're trending in that direction, but there's still a long way to go. Consistency is probably one of the toughest things as a young player to find. Now, some people took that quote and they ran with it, and they thought, well, if he's talking about depth, that means he's not going to trade any of those young guys, and that it's going to be an issue. I don't think so. Like, I think that means he views Tippett and Forster and those kind of guys as being fine. That they're not the most incredible supporting cast, that they maybe don't have the same kind of high upside, but they're still good. Like, they're still good players. And if Mishkov is going to turn into the star you want him to be, he's got to have at least competent guys around him. And hopefully they grow together. And if they grow together, the team is ultimately going to be better for it. All right, we're going to go back to another Briere quote from this TSN thing. He says, what I've been most impressed with Matt Fay is how he reacts to the benching, how he reacts to missing a few shifts or being challenged or called out in front of his teammates. He responds. He's got a special character in a good way. He's ultra competitive. I think when he was younger, we heard some rumors that he was a bad teammate, but I think it was part of it is he didn't know how to channel it. He didn't know how to tell his teammates that they have to work harder and work at the same level as him. He's maturing, but really what's impressive is how he answers the bell. Already at his age, he's not afraid of the big moments. He actually welcomes the big times in a game where he can make a difference. He really believes he's there to make a difference. That's not something you can teach. You have it or you don't. You're afraid of the moment or you're not. So far, already at 19, it's impressive that he has that and feels confident enough to want to be a real difference maker every game. Now, I said this last night on the Press Row Show, but the thing that is the most encouraging to me about how Mishkov plays is how Mishkov plays in these big games when he plays against teams like Toronto. Like, when Frost puts up his second half points every year, a lot of times he does that against bottom-feeding teams, which is why people were still kind of down on Morgan Frost. In the case of Mishkov, he rises to the occasion against some of the better teams. He shows up to play. Again, 7 shots through 2 periods last night, finishes with 8 shots on goal, draws that penalty. he was actively involved in that game. And the final stat sheet might not look like he had a huge impact on the game, but he did. He had an impact. And to be just recently turned 20, I don't know, guys. Like I feel pretty good. Pretty good about it. The part that had people the most concerned, and I'm going over to Reddit for this, they were talking about the rebuild. And this is, I think, where people did actually have the right to be a little bit more concerned and a little bit more upset. Briere says to TSN, I think everybody wants more star power. We all want the Connor McDavid and the Austin Matthews, etc. But the reality is those guys are extremely tough to find. There's a chance that a guy like Mishkov could turn into close to a star or a superstar, but you otherwise need depth. So that was the part that was kind of omitted before. And then he kind of builds off and he says, for us, you always have 2 or 3 guys that are not going and become a good team. And I think that's one of those things that we need. And so it's tough. You look at the teams that are stuck at the bottom of the standings. So it's tough to get there, or it's tough to get out of it. That's part of why when we talked about the rebuild, we didn't want to fall all the way down to the bottom. We wanted to stay competitive and have our young guys learn through a competitive team and a team that has a chance to win and make the playoffs because it's so tough to get out of there. Now, I think that we need to be careful, and I think that maybe we'll break this down a little bit more on Friday. This idea that it's hard to get out of the slop, out of the bottom, there is truth to it. But the Flyers haven't exactly been a competitive team, right? Like the Flyers haven't exactly spent the last decade as a truly competitive team. They've been an on-again, off-again team in the postseason with Claude Giroux. In the time since Giroux has left, they have largely been an underwhelming team, a far less talented team on most nights. The difference is that some of these teams that do race to the bottom, they end up finding their superstars of the future, and they turn it around. Chicago's really bad right now. Would you like to have Connor Bedard? Bedard's had a little bit of a rough season, a rough rookie or rough sophomore season. Do I think that if Chicago is able to go out and get one of the top players in the draft this year, that perhaps you pair that guy with Bedard and all of a sudden Chicago's future looks a lot brighter? I do. Do I think that if the Flyers managed to pick somewhere around number 3, number 4 in the upcoming draft and pair that player with Mishkov, that it would ultimately be better for them long term? I do. So this whole notion that like it's hard to get out of the bottom, I'd argue it's harder to get out of hockey purgatory, where the team has been for a very, very long time. I would argue it's harder to get out of purgatory because purgatory is where a front office lands when they are trying to win with a team that's not very good, and they try to sell themselves on the idea that they're one move away. Chuck Fletcher did that for years. It was a largely underwhelming team, and he would just keep telling himself, if we can get a Matt Niskanen, if we can bring Matt Niskanen back, it's going to change our fortunes. If we go out and get Ryan Ellis, who was hurt, we go out and get Ryan Ellis, it's going to make us a better team. We're going to be a cup contender, which they weren't going to be. If front offices, especially as a GM or a president of hockey ops, as they get to their 3rd, 4th year, they start to feel the pressure. Because if the results are underwhelming, they know there is a finite amount of time before the ownership swings the axe. In the cases of Briere and Jones, they came in with carte blanche. They had the ability, if they really wanted to tear it down to the studs and to do that for 2 years. This is the 2nd year. They got lucky that in their first draft, they were able to get a falling Matvei Mishkov. This past draft, they picked Jet Lashenko, who some believe might have been a reach. And some, had hoped that last year they would have been in a higher draft position where they could have gotten a guy like, an Ivan Demidov, who also is Russian, has played with Mishkov, and probably would have some good chemistry, and I think is going to be a very good player for Montreal. Your little fake playoff run last year, your race to try to make the playoffs last year, ultimately was a waste. And I don't care that you think that it was good for the culture. It ultimately was bad for the team. Now, if Jet Lashenko somehow becomes the best player, the second best player in that draft, and you could say, hey, well, the guys got to learn what it was like to win and try to go after the playoffs, and we still end up with this great player, then fine. Cool. Great job to the scouting department. Great job to the front office. I'll eat crow 2-3 years from now when we know that to be certain. But as of right now, not totally sold on it. Genuinely not. And if they're going to put themselves in position again to be in hockey purgatory, they have the 8th fewest points right now. If the season were to end now and nobody jumped anyone else in the lottery, the Flyers would pick 8th. Is that a terrible place to pick? No. Would I like to see them fall a little bit more and to be somewhere around like number 4 by the end of the season? Yes. Why? Because lottery luck could dictate that two other teams could jump above you. That's just how the lottery works. So if you finish with the 4th fewest points in the league, the worst you could pick is 6th if you somehow get jumped by 2 teams below you. If only one team jumps you, you're still picking in the top 5. If you're number 8 and 2 teams jump you, that's number 10. And whether it's you think that there's a big talent disparity between number 8 and 10, or you just think it's going to be hard to convince a team that maybe is in the top 7 to move down to 10 instead of down to 8, all of these things matter. They're all factors.